get into it, let me start, Alex, and I think you were the one who picked this meme, so I think you should explain. Alex, his meme game is
I'll explain the meme later.
okay, perfect. Yeah, but basically, the thing that we want to lead with is this statement, which is promotion is about behavior, not output. And so let me first caveat that by saying that we're not saying that output doesn't matter. Output is like a baseline. You have to produce good quality, high quality software on time in order to get promoted. Like you need to do good work, right? That's the baseline. But actually, on top of that, in order to really get promoted, especially at the more senior levels, your promotion will be dictated not just by your output, but also by your behavior. And in some ways, your behavior is more important. And the explanation for this is that raw output doesn't scale. And what we mean by that is, by the time you're a junior software engineer, the expectation is that you are able to write high quality code, right? Like you're able to actually write production level code, right? That's why you're hired as an engineer. But the thing is that if you think about, okay, well, that's how I'm being measured, I'm writing code, then in order to get promoted to a mid-level engineer and then senior engineer, and then think about like a staff or principal engineer, each level is expected to have like 2x or 3x the amount of impact. And so if you are purely looking at this from the perspective of how many lines of code did that person write, then you're going to get to the point where like a junior engineer writes 100 lines of code a day, but then a principal engineer is expected to write like 5,000 lines of code every day. And that's simply not possible. You cannot code that much. Raw output doesn't scale. And so that's why the way that you're able to sustain that much impact as a principal engineer is through behavior, right? So because there are only so many hours in a day, you have to utilize those hours in a more impactful way than just writing more code. You have to actually write frameworks, architectures, which allow other people to write code. That is really the mark of someone who is more senior. That behavior is exhibiting more senior behavior. That behavior is exhibiting a more senior characteristic. And so the takeaway here is that you should really focus on how over what. So when you look at, hopefully at a company where you have some sort of mentorship structure or some sort of way to get feedback, then what you should do is look at the people around you who are doing really well and think about how are they achieving what they're achieving. And usually it's not just by locking themselves in a corner into a room and just coding nonstop. I mean, that could be one way of achieving it. But again, it only goes so far. So really the better way, or the especially at these big companies, the way you need to operate is to unblock other people, to change your behavior to create more impact for yourself and the whole team. So that really is how you should be thinking about what the difference is between junior and senior. And then one really good lens through which to take a look at this is that senior engineers act differently across levels, meaning that if you have like a level 5, so let me walk through really quick the Facebook scale. So like level 5 is referred to as senior, level 6 is referred to as staff, 7 is senior staff. These are kind of unofficial names that are not, technically in the Facebook guideline. But it's actually quite interesting to think about someone who's like a level 8, which is like extreme, like probably less than 1% of engineers are level 8. Compare that to a level 5 engineer, which is maybe like 30 or 40% of the company. And I can tell you for sure, if you walk into a team and if you observe the team for like a week, or not even a week, a day, it should become painfully obvious to you who is the level 5 engineer and who is a level 8 engineer. And the way you'll be able to identify that is because people will naturally start to gravitate toward the level 8 engineer in order to get help, to get unblocked. When you look at meetings, that level 8 engineer it'll be so obvious to you that that person is the one who is setting the vision and architecture for the whole team. So that I think is a really good way to think about, like, I'm a certain level now. What does it mean to operate at the next level? And then if you extend it out to infinity, to the most senior level in the company, how should my mindset or how should my behavior change to reflect that?
Yeah, I pretty much 100% agree with everything that like Rahul has said. And I think one way to think about it is everyone has access to the same 24 hours in a day, right? And then if you go to like working hours, it's 8 and you can maybe stretch yourself to 9 or 10. So you'll look at these very, very senior engineers, like these senior staff or principal level engineers, and like at the big tech companies where just for reference at the like the top tech companies, the pay bands are quite large. So every promotion is like a huge jump in compensation. Like you'll have the principal engineers making like 5 or 10x what the most junior engineers in the company do. And it's not like they somehow created a time turner where they can work like 35, 40-hour days. They have access to the same amount of time the most junior engineer in the company does, but they're able to deliver impact on a much greater scale. So my meta piece of advice, which is what I tell a lot of my mentees, is when you're observing other like engineers, especially those who are more senior than you, because that's one of the more straightforward paths to become more senior, right? You look at someone who's way more senior than you and you just look at what they're doing. But well, more importantly, you should look at how they're doing what they're doing. Because if you just focus on like their impact, which is like the shiny projects they deliver and like, the code that they write, you're going to be losing track of like what makes them senior. Like you should be looking at how they're doing that. And here are just like some of like the questions you can ask yourself when you're observing a very senior engineer to like really truly understand like how they're adding like this very unique type of value to the company. So let's say you see this extremely senior engineer like ship some new product, and it does really well, it takes off, director is very happy, yada yada yada. You just ask them like, how did they come up with the idea for this project, and how did they convince so many people to rally behind them delivering this product? Because if this big fancy product launch, it's not very likely they coded it out entirely on their own. That's just not humanly possible. They probably built a team around it. How did they build the team around it? How did they make the team excited to work behind this product? Why did they choose this particular product idea over all the other ones? Because when you go to any like top tech company, you're going to have so many amazing ideas in the room. Like the problem will be, okay, how do we increase this metric by 50%? You're going to have like 50 ideas to increase that metric by some amount of percent, like what they think will be 50%. How do you choose the right one? How did this very senior engineer choose the right one? And another question you can ask is, how did they figure out exactly what to build? Because generally what happens is when you come up with an idea, it's just a sentence or two, right? That's what an idea is. But how do they convert this idea into like, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lines of code that actually makes up the ship product they came up with at the end, right? Like how do they clear up all this ambiguity and take this like super giant hazy thing into an actual product?
Yeah, and just before going on to the next slide, I want to share one story which I think will be illuminating for people here. When I left Pinterest and I came to Facebook, I was hired in as a level 5 engineer, a senior engineer, as per the naming convention in a lot of the Silicon Valley companies, including Facebook, right? So I was hired in as level 5, and I just want to be transparent or like share something vulnerable here, is that for the first few months at Facebook, I felt like, okay, I felt pretty good about myself. Like, wow, I'm a senior engineer here at Fang. I feel happy. But frankly, I wasn't doing senior level work. And the way that my manager delivered that feedback to me, I think really taught me a good lesson about how to think about promotion and how to think about seniority, which is that he asked me, how far in advance do I know what I'll be working on? And the honest answer was that because I was like relatively new to the company, it was about 3 or 4 months in, I was still trying to figure out what to do. I was still ramping up on the code base. And most of my work, most of my days were spent working with a tech lead. And she was basically saying, hey, here's something that you can tackle. Can you please take a look? And then, maybe a couple of days later, I would go back and say, okay, well, I did that, or I couldn't do it for this reason, or I was able to identify this thing that has to happen first, or whatever the outcome might be. I would come back to her and say, okay, what else should I do? And that is actually the mark of someone who isn't ready for a senior level role or a staff level role, right? So that question of how far in advance do you know what you're going to work on is actually a very good litmus test to determine promotion or determine seniority. If you're junior, you're probably going to know for a couple of days what you're going to do. If you're mid-level, maybe like a couple of weeks because you're owning some full feature. And if you're senior, really the expectation is that you should know high level what you're going to work on for the whole quarter. For 3 months, you should say, okay, this is kind of how I'm going to spend my time for 3 months. And especially when you start to get to staff engineer or principal engineer, you should not only know what you're going to work on for several months at a time, but also you should be creating swim lanes for the other people on your team to know what you're going to work on. And so I think once I heard that feedback, once I started at Facebook, then I think I started to change how I approached my work to being much more proactive. And when I started to become more proactive, that's really when I started to actually figure out a roadmap of here's what I'll work on for 3 months. And I think honestly, that really saved me from the perspective of being able to do much, much better and actually get promoted again later on. So I think that for me, I'm really thankful for my first manager at Facebook for really giving me that critical feedback, and it turned me around from the promotion perspective.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I just realized I forgot to explain the meme. So
Oh yeah.
you can probably understand it to like how we're talking about it. I feel like this work smart, not hard is an oversimplification, but it was kind of the quickest meme that I could find that at least like generally encapsulated this concept like decently well. I just really wanted to avoid that like one where everyone's pushing the cubes and then like this one person like essentially destroyed his cube to make it into a sphere and he's like pushing that instead. But I think the the hairs running actually captures I think the junior engineer trap pretty well. So a lot of junior engineers, they join the company and they go, all right, I'm writing code and I'm like not very good at writing code and I can't write it super fast. So getting promoted just means that I write like more complex code and I just write it faster, which is true to some extent. Generally going from like the junior to like the mid-level is mostly doing that. But you'll realize that you'll hit physical walls, right? Your hands can only type so fast. You only have so many hours in a day, yada, 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 as mentioned before. So going from mid-level to senior, you can't keep doing that mentality. You can't just hustle more in order to get promoted. And this is actually dangerous because if you go too far down this, like, I'm just going to hustle harder to get promoted, that's actually a sign that you're actually not ready to get promoted. Because as mentioned throughout this entire section of the session, promotion is about behavior, not output. So if you're only able to like put together the appearance of like a senior engineer by just working super, super hard, it doesn't really mean you're a senior engineer. You're just kind of faking it because you're just working harder than like everyone, like you're working physically more hours than like everyone else. And that's actually kind of like, let's say you got promoted because you essentially did this, ultra hustle way of getting promoted. That just doesn't really work out well for anyone because you're eventually going to burn out. So that sucks for you. And then if you got promoted to this level, you can't really sustain and you burn out, the company is going to have to essentially fire you at some point because you're not going to be able to sustain the next level performance for much longer. Essentially, like the boost you have by working extra hard is going to go away. And it's just going to be really messy for everyone. So, especially once you're going to senior levels in tech, it doesn't really matter. I think just any part of tech, it doesn't have to only be an engineer. Start thinking about, how can I alter my behavior to add more value and like a different type of value versus how can I just do more of what I'm already doing.
Cool. We spent a lot of time on this slide. I promise that future slides we're not going to spend that long on. But real quick, can I get some feedback? So like using the Zoom reaction feature, just tell us like thumbs up, go faster, go slower. If this was helpful for you, just would love to just understand if people are still here. Okay, I see some reactions. All right, this is good. Let's move on then. So the takeaway from the previous slide was it's about behavior, not output. So then one question becomes, how can you start operating at that senior level? And a big part of that is you need to have the scope, right? You need to increase your scope. You need to be able to be trusted with a large enough surface area where you can actually set that roadmap. You can actually create the swim lanes that I talked about for other people on the team. And so then there's a question of how do you increase your scope so you can start acting at that next level, whatever it might be. So Alex, do you want to talk about this? I think you were the one who.
Sure, yeah. So increasing your scope and just being promoted to senior levels in particular in general is you start adding multiplicative value versus additive value. So additive value is, I think, pretty straightforward to understand. It's generally the value that pretty much every junior engineer is doing. Junior engineer gets a project. They get some designs or requirements or whatever, and then they have to build out their piece of the project, usually on one part of the stack. They have to build the web portion, the Android portion, the backend portion, and then they ship it, and everyone's happy, and they move on to the next project. So that's additive value because essentially the only kind of business impact you added during that exchange was that code you wrote. It's just this one-off thing. And then you move on to the next one-off thing. So that's additive value. So what's multiplicative value? Multiplicative value is when you start thinking in terms of, okay, this work I'm doing, does it actually leave a legacy? Is it not just this one-off thing that I just ship and then forget about and then move on to the next thing? Will it actually have impact on the rest of the company, like going forward? So a very good example of this is what, like Rahul mentioned before, like you build infra, you build frameworks. Like let's say you build some like component, like some common code component that is it's used in your product. So we're assuming you're still a product engineer, but then you built it in a generic way so it can be easily be reused, and a bunch of future projects use it, both your future projects and future projects of people in your team, in your org, etc. So that's multiplicative value, because you built this one thing, but it's used by like 20, 30, 40 other engineers, right? So your scope is increased. And this kind of brings me to the core point here, which is, how do you measure what your scope is? Just figure out how many people you're positively influencing. And essentially, the more people you're positively influencing, the bigger your scope is. And the less people you're positively influencing, the less your scope is. Like that kind of junior engineer example that I mentioned before, like just scope is one. You're just writing it so you're meeting your expectations as a junior engineer, you don't get fired. It's not like other people are looking at the code that you wrote and be, oh yeah, this is helping me. This one-off product code is helping me. Like that doesn't happen, right? So like you'll start seeing like senior engineers like influence like 10, 25 like people, like they'll lead 10, 25 people to build components that help 10, 25 people. And then like staff will be like 25, 50 people. And then like once you get to like these crazy like principal levels, you'll see engineers like doing either writing code or essentially altering culture and process that affects like 100 to 250 people. So yeah, when you are trying to figure out how to increase your scope, and this is a behavior that very senior engineers will take on, you have to understand the concept of social capital. So I'm sure everyone here understands the concept of capital, which is money. It's very easy to measure. It's like, you have different pieces of capital which have numeric value attached to them. Social capital is a lot more fuzzy, which is why I think a lot of people don't really understand why, like, don't understand like what it means and like that it exists. But the idea behind social capital is you start treating like your relationships, like your connections with other people, as a resource, similar to how you would treat money as a resource. And the reason you need to do this, building social capital, is, again, you're trying to increase your scope and you're positively influence people. People are not going to be influenced by you if you don't have a good relationship with them. If you have a bad relationship or no relationship, like you've never really talked to them or helped them, then they're going to be resistant to your changes. Like when you try to push like some process change or code change that affects like them and 100 other engineers. So what you'll see is, when very senior engineers join like a new team, not only do they try to understand the code base that they're going into, they try to understand the people base as well. Like they'll go in and they'll understand like, okay, who's doing what, who has this working style, who has that working style. And then they'll essentially figure out, a plan to essentially merge well in a healthy way with that people base, so they can build the relationships they need to push big decisions, similar to how you would kind of come up with a plan to understand a code base, where it's like, oh yeah, this is like the main view controller, so I'm going to understand that first, and then kind of go down to these like view components and then understand those. They do the same thing, but with people. Yeah, Rahul, anything to add here?
Yeah, and I think the last point around how to increase your scope, I think Alex touched on this, is around looking for problems. Because I think that when you identify a problem and you provide your opinion on it, or even better than providing an opinion, is actually doing something either code related or non-code related, but something to address that problem, and it improves the lives of either your teammates or the end users, such that now your team can hit the goal that they set out because you moved some metric. That is really how you are able to build trust, increase your scope, and build those relationships that are so necessary to get promoted. And I think if you're at a high growth tech company, which I think many of you, like many people want to be in those roles, I think this is actually a reason why you want to be in one of those roles, is because if you're at FANG or if you're at a high growth tech company, there will always be problems. That's kind of the ironic thing about it, is that those problems are opportunities for you. So I'll give you a concrete example. When I joined Pinterest in 2015, the whole company was around 400 people. When I left, a little bit less than 3 years later, I think the company had quadrupled in size. There was a huge period of growth in the 2.5, 3 years I was there. And so what that meant was the tools or processes or like the code review structure that we had, the things that worked last year simply didn't work the next year. And so then as a junior engineer or senior engineer, whoever you are, if you can call out that, hey, this thing that was working is no longer working. And here's my thought about how to fix it. I'm going to implement it. I'm going to get feedback on it. And I'm going to actually land that change. That is really how you're able to build up trust and then increase your scope. So if you're at a company where you feel like things are stagnant, there are not enough problems to tackle, that's actually a sign that you're not in the right company. So either you should be actively looking for another job, or you should try and find opportunities to have that impact, to have that scope in your current company. And I think the beauty of companies like Pinterest or even companies like Google, it's so big, but still their headcount is like increasing 40, 50% year over year because they're doing so well, right? So that's the kind of company that you want to work at, I think, in terms of career growth. And so one important point of having the social capital that Alex mentioned is being able to have a positive relationship with your peers. And so one thing I wanted to talk about, which I think people, especially engineers, are a little bit shy to do or they're not comfortable doing, but I really think this is important for promotion, is that you have to communicate your work. And another way of phrasing it is that you have to sell your work. And tactically, what that means is you have to be able to make status updates, post announcements. You have to be able to speak up in meetings in order to market yourself in your projects. So I think that this mentality of like, let me put my head down and just do what I need to do, and then things will happen to me, that doesn't really work. You have to actually take the active step, the active effort to put yourself out there and get feedback and interact with people. And it's really interesting because like I recently transitioned to something called a tech lead manager role. And by the way, I'm switching back to an IC role, like an individual contributor role, but I can explain that. The story for why I switched and why I'm switching back is probably not now's not the time for that. But basically, when I was in this TLM role, I had one of my reports. He came to me when I gave him this feedback and said, "That just feels icky. I don't want to sell myself." And I just thought that was like a very nice way of phrasing the concern. Is that, do you feel icky? And I think the response I gave him was that you shouldn't really feel icky about selling your work for two reasons. Number one, if your work, the things that you're doing every day, like your primary project, if it truly is adding value, then your communication about that project will be welcome. Any status updates you make, any announcements you make will be welcome because people are aware of how important your project is, whether that will improve the tooling for the engineers or it'll move some metric for the end user because you're shipping some new feature, or if you're building some infra that other people in the company are going to rely on, your work is important. And so therefore people will care about it. And if you feel like your work is not important, that's a problem. You should fix that first because you're anyway not going to get promoted if your work isn't important. But I think the second thing that doesn't make this icky is that there's a way that you are able to communicate your updates that actually make the people around you feel good about it. The updates that you make will let you acknowledge contributions from people, because especially at these big tech companies or even mid-sized or small companies, nothing is a solo effort. You will always constantly be working with many, many people. And so having the kind of regular communication with your team is a way for you to acknowledge their contribution. And again, that goes back to helping you because you're creating these deep social ties, which will be necessary when they write you peer feedback, and it'll help you grow your career. So I want to make this really concrete for people. And I like people talk about, how come we can't leave the recording up permanently? This is exactly why we're not going to leave the recording up permanently. Because I want to be transparent with everyone who's here. I'm going to show some screenshots of some of the work that I actually did. I changed some of the coworkers' names because obviously, like I don't want to like I don't have their consent to like show their name in this presentation. Like basically, the context of what I'm going to show you is that I was working on this very large cross-functional project, which is a re-architecture. And I refer to that as ReArch. That was like the abbreviation for it. And it was a very long process of like implementing it for about 9 months. And it was a very long rollout process. And so here's how it started. In December of 2020, I basically tagged most of the people who were involved in the project. There were 18 people. So like, by the way, this is an internal tool at Facebook that we use. And so that's what you're kind of seeing screenshots of here. But the idea is that, for most of the people who are involved in the project, I tagged them because I wanted them to get a notification that, hey, we're doing this production test. It's a big milestone. We're starting it next week. And that number one, going back to what I just told everyone, is that this re-architecture, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the company, this was actually a very important project. So I wanted everyone to be aware. So I didn't feel icky doing this because I knew this is important for all the people involved. And second, by tagging everyone, I was basically able to say, hey, this is not just me shipping this big feature. There are many, many other smart people who helped me and they contributed a lot. So I want to acknowledge them. And so basically, December 11th, we start this rollout. After we come back from the holidays, it turns out the experiment had some metrics regression. This is a very common thing at big tech. You're going to roll out a feature. It's going to hurt a metric. It might improve another metric, but you end up saying, hey, this is not worth it. Go back to the drawing board and figure out how to rerun the experiment. And so basically, I'm communicating here that here's the experiment, here's a post which has more information about it, and here's the next step, right? Now, I launched the V2 experiment on January 22nd. And then turns out that experiment got imbalanced. And if you have an imbalanced experiment, any correlation or any causation conclusion that you draw is invalid. You have to make sure that your experiment is balanced before you can conclude anything safely. And so now, Jan 26, we start a V3 experiment. Then 2 weeks later or so, we launch a V4 experiment to 50%. And then finally, on March 12th, about 3 months after the rollout started, we finally got to shipping this pretty huge feature to 100%. And so basically you can see the track record here, right? Like I was consistently every 2 or 3 weeks, I was posting an update about what I had done, what's the next step, who helped me, what information needs to get out. And I think that if you do this in a consistent way, you are really able to build up a lot of trust with your team. And I think this was a really critical part of a lot of the positive peer feedback I got, because people knew that, hey, if I have a question about this re-architecture project, I know 100%, I'm 100% certain that Rahul will be able to guide me and tell me the correct answer. And so I think this is why being able to communicate and market yourself or market your project is so important to your career and to promotion.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul, for this excellent example. Just to add on to that, this kind of communication bit before we move on to the next part of the content, is I noticed that a lot of like junior engineers in particular, they believe that there's like this all-seeing eye at any place they work, where no matter what happens, like this all-seeing eye will just know what everyone is doing all the time, and then by the time performance review comes around, like every 6 months, every 12 months, it will just have this objective, fair accounting of everything that everyone's ever done. And then all the points will be doled out fairly, and everyone who deserves a promotion will get it. You can't just do good work and expect to get promoted. That is only half at most of what it takes to get promoted, especially if you're moving in like a top tech company, which generally the top 10 companies move very, very fast. It is very easy for people to lose track of what you're doing, which is why optics are so important, and which is why the communication and like selling your work is so important. Because if you don't do this, you're gonna end up in a situation where you did a bunch of good work, but since you didn't actually communicate and like have a presence in like all these status update posts or meetings or whatever tool that your company uses to track track work and then like sync, people are not even going to realize that you did all this great work, and you're not going to get the proper credit for it come performance review time.
Yeah, and actually, this is another point that I forgot to mention. I think, Alex, you were the one who had this idea, which I love, around like having this brag journal or like this documentation. So another reason why I think it's so important, the context there, by the way, is that, Alex was basically pitching the idea, which I think came from a blog or something, right, Alex? Basically, the idea is like you write down what you've done. And so at the end of the half or the end of the performance review cycle, you can very easily look back at your brag document. So here are all the really amazing things I've done. And that's one more reason why I feel like what I've shown here on this slide is so important, because like if you have a permanent resource, like a track record of here's what I've done, here's like the updates in the experiment, it's undeniable to your manager and to everyone else that you are worthy of having this scope and doing well, right? So that's another big reason why, communicating your work is so important.
Yep. Yeah. The brag journal we'll talk more about in a later section, but yeah, let's move on to the next section, which is have a plan. So yeah, promotions are hard, especially the more senior ones. So you can't just go into it being like, I'm just going to work hard and do awesome stuff like I have always done. That's not going to get you promoted. And I think the first part of coming up with a good plan is to find your strengths. So you're naturally going to be a lot more productive if you're doing something that you enjoy. And this sounds obvious, but it's actually much easier said than done. And I've noticed in particular, like all the advice that Rahul and I try to give, these stem from real world experiences. We're not just making stuff up. I've seen most of the junior engineers that I've mentored, they don't seriously take the time to do this step of creating a plan. They're kind of in that mode of, I'm a junior engineer, you give me a task, I do the task, and then I ask for the next task, which is kind of similar to what like Rahul was describing when he first started at Facebook. And this part is it's not actually like concretely doing any work, like this kind of find your strengths exercise. It's mainly like kind of mental and introspecting, but it's so important because the way I see it, this step is kind of the foundation for your entire growth plan, like in tech, like getting promoted as as many levels as you can across your career. So yeah, as mentioned before, like you're naturally going to be more efficient when you're playing to your strengths. Facebook in particular, like explicitly describes itself as a strengths-based organization. I think they even had a number where it's like 70% of the time you should be working on something that you genuinely enjoy. And I agree with that. Like it just makes sense where you should have people working on things that they're both good at and actually enjoy. So how do we do this? I think there's really no like clear-cut process because this is a very fuzzy exercise and it varies based on who you are. But the main thing is that you should regularly take time to reflect early on in your career. I know it can be hard to do that because especially when you start a job, you're like, oh, I just need to like ship all these things as fast as I can to like look good. And but the problem with that is that you get lost in the work and you get into this reactive state that Rahul talked about before, where you're just doing what you can to survive, and you don't actually take the time to think of a roadmap, of a plan going forward. What's your plan besides just survive? You should have one, and you need to do this in order to essentially craft a path for yourself to get promoted. So what I've done with many of the engineers that I mentor is I'll actually conduct a formal exercise. If you don't have a mentor, then you can do it on your own, though it may be more difficult. But the idea is, after you've been working for a while, like let's say I think if you're like new to a team or company, I would do this like 1 or 2 months in, even if you're very junior. 1 or 2 months in should be enough time to get like sufficient signal. I'm like, okay, what does my life look like here? What am I doing? What are the different behaviors they need me to exhibit? And write down everything that you do. Like what is your, not day to day, because days can vary a lot, but like, what does your week to week look like? Like how much time do you spend writing code, reviewing code, fighting with Jira, doing data analysis, talking with designers, etc. Just write down like all the different things you do and try to split them up into 3 different buckets. The first one is something that you genuinely enjoy. And I define genuinely enjoy as this is something that you could do at work. You can easily work late into the night doing this particular thing, and it won't feel like work. You'll actually be happy about it. Like it's very easy for you to get lost in this particular like task or behavior because you enjoy it so much. The second bucket is neutral. A lot of stuff is going to fall into this bucket, but neutral is like you can do it, and you can do it for long periods of time. But within that 8-hour kind of work span, this is not something you get lost in. It's like, okay, I do this because I need to do it in order to keep my job, and it's okay. It's not too bad. But if it crosses the boundary into my life, outside of that work-life boundary, then I won't be too happy. The last bucket is chores, which is something that you are pretty much only doing in order to keep your job, because you have to do it. A lot of like bureaucratic operational stuff often falls under this, especially for engineers. And these are the things like even within the scope of work, like you can't do a ton. Like you can't do this like 3 to 5 days a week out of your work week. Maybe you can do it for like 2-3 hours like every week or something on just one day. So the important thing here is you essentially want to get as you want to figure out what goes in that first bucket, and you want to essentially communicate that to your manager, which we'll talk about later, and then kind of form a plan around that. And I hope all of you here can find at least one thing that goes into that bucket. And you can always do this on the fly. Like you can, of course, wait like a month or whatever every few months to do this exercise. But if you notice like yourself getting lost in something, and you have this moment where it's like, oh my God, I've been working on this until like 10 p.m., but I was having so much fun, I lost track of time. Write that down. Like, what were you doing? Like, what made you get lost until 10 p.m. like out of sheer enjoyment? That's super important. Yeah, Rahul, any thoughts here?
Yeah, the one thing I'll add here is that I think people are often surprised by what other people enjoy that they don't enjoy. And that's a gift, because when you have people with diverse interests, or they enjoy different things, then you actually have a more robust team, because you can do the work that you enjoy and they can do the work that they enjoy, and the team can still operate. Because what you want to avoid is that everyone wants to do this one thing, and so you have to kind of drag people out and do the not likable thing. But you'll actually often be surprised that if you're able to voice what you like, and you do that exercise that Alex mentioned, and you actually reflect on what I like, and you talk about that with your manager or your team, you can actually figure out a situation. You can manufacture a situation where you can do more of that. I'll give you one example, which is that I have never liked being on call. It's kind of like I get pinged, I get alerts, and it's kind of stressful. But then I talked to a teammate, and it somehow came up that he really, really loves being on call. Like the act of jumping in and firefighting and kind of saving the day and all that, like he loved. And that kind of blew my mind, because like I was like, why? Like that's so weird. Why? Why do you like being on call? But then when I had that realization that, hey, I don't like being on call, and that means I can do the thing that I actually really enjoy, which is like actually writing docs and communicating with people and writing code. He can do more of the on-call work. And so we actually have a very healthy team dynamic because of that. You don't have to do the things that you don't like, as long as you're communicating about the pros and cons of like what's on your plate, right? That's kind of the main thing, just being transparent and open with your team.
Side note, I also enjoy being on call because I feel like you're shielding the team. So Rahul, if we're ever working together again, we can figure something out.
Yeah, definitely. And then let me start this slide. So the idea here is that your manager is critical to your promotion. That's probably not a surprise to anyone, but let me go a little bit further in making a more extreme statement, which is that at most companies I'm familiar with, or let me actually say it this way, at all companies that I'm familiar with, which are primarily, the American-based Silicon Valley companies, if your manager is not supportive of you getting promoted, you will not get promoted. And so I think that it really is critical that you need to have a working relationship and a positive relationship, ideally, with your manager. And your manager is also going to be critical for you understanding what the gaps are or what you need to do. And so step number one here is that you need to create a plan. Ideally, at the beginning of the half or the beginning of the performance review cycle, you have a plan with your manager, and you say, here's what it means to meet expectations for the half. Here's what it means to exceed expectations. And here's what it means to blow it out of the park and get promoted. Like you should have very concrete discussions about what it means to not do well, do slightly above expectation, and way above, right? Like all these different levels you should have communication about. And then at the end of the half, you should not be surprised about the rating or the feedback that you're getting. Because if your manager is doing a good job, you should be in constant communication about how things are going. And if the plan is deviating from what you had originally set out, you should talk about what impact does that have in terms of the performance review. And so if you have a good manager, then you should not have that be a surprise. And it's also a two-way street, which is not just that you're being acted upon. You should be actively managing that relationship and asking for feedback. And so if you feel like the manager is not doing a great job, it's up to you then to fill in the gap and start having that more active conversation.
Yeah, and to add on to this, I think one of the core points here is that you essentially need to flip the idea of what a traditional manager and report relationship is. I think the vast majority of people, not just junior engineers, but just most people working in general, even outside of tech, is that you serve your manager. Like your manager is like some authority, and you just have to do the work that they give you and avoid pissing them off. That is true to some extent, but I think what separates like the people who grow really fast, and this culture is represented at the top tech companies like Facebook and Google, is that you should actually treat your manager as a resource. So instead of you serving your manager, it's actually like your manager should serve you, because the manager isn't just some person who like cracks the whip. That's not the case in tech. Like, I think one of the reasons why tech is so successful is that it kind of got rid of all these very inefficient traditional corporate culture aspects, and it just completely reinvented them to be like way more humane and efficient. So when you like are joining a new company, a new team, you should essentially figure out, okay, how can I leverage my manager? How can I, you know, have them serve me so that I can grow as fast as I can, so I can essentially deliver value for them and their team as efficiently and as like broad a scope away as possible. And this is a bit tricky because it's kind of a help me help you type of situation. So getting the mindset correct is just the first part, which is, start seeing your manager as a resource and start seeing, the manager serving you versus you serving them. And then after that, you need to figure out like how you can provide the proper inputs so the manager can properly help you, which we will talk about in like a later slide. But yeah, flip the relationship. Don't just see yourself as like, I got to serve the manager and make them happy, and they're like some sort of like, if I do wrong, then I'm going to get, canned or whatever. You don't want to have that perception, because it won't let you build that relationship between you and your manager for you to actually grow. And then that also causes a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, and then in terms of what that actually means with like your schedule, you should regularly be in contact with your manager. That typically manifests in a weekly one-on-one. But if you have anything less than like a bi-weekly, like for example, you meet your manager every 2 months, that is certainly not enough unless you have other like asynchronous ways of getting feedback. I would be concerned if you're not meeting your manager at least every 2 weeks. So I think having that regular check-in, either in a doc or like some sort of written down form where you can refer to it later, that is really important to maintain that with your manager.
All right,
and then, yeah, go for it, Alex.
Oh yeah. So anyways, so I think this is becoming more and more the standard at tech companies in general. And this is why, as we talked about before, like it's so important to like flip that relationship with your manager. So to be honest, there was a time when it did make more sense to see your manager as this authority, like, and you pretty much do everything you could to make them happy. Because how performance review has traditionally worked is that your manager is essentially like, they're a boss. They're essentially like they dictate the circumstances of your world. And then the performance review would just involve like whoever your manager's manager is, or like some very senior person asking like, oh yeah, how did, Alex or Rahul perform for the half? The manager gives you a score, and then that's our score. But that's changing. And for the most part, and for pretty much every company I've been at, minus my first job at PayPal, how the performance review works is the manager will continue providing some notes on like, oh yeah, this is how Alex did like for the half or for the year. But you'll also get feedback from other people within the team, and this becomes really complicated because, as mentioned before, the very senior engineers, they influence a lot of people. So they're going to get a ton of feedback they need to get a ton of positive feedback from a lot of different people. And that actually this entire thing becomes an exercise that you have to manage, because as we all know, working with people is very difficult.
Yeah, so basically, in terms of how this feedback actually works, right? So as Alex mentioned, at most of these companies now, you're going to have some structured way of getting feedback from your peers, from your manager, and yourself. And that self-feedback, that self-review that you write is very important to making a case for your career growth, whether that means a promotion or just a good rating for that performance cycle. So a couple pieces of advice that Alex and I have here is that remember that as humans, we just have a very hard time remembering things. Our brains are not designed to like instantly recall the date and time of a specific event, right? Especially on like a multi-month time scale, which is typically what your performance review cycle is going to be operating on. And so to combat that, what you should do is you should write down what you succeeded at. And also I would recommend, writing down the things where you have struggled, but you can decide whether to share those or not. But at least certainly your wins, you should regularly write those down so you can easily have basically a brag journal that you can point your manager to and say, hey, manager, if you need to defend me in calibration, or if you need to be able to say good things about me, like you want to make your manager's job easy to be able to see the positive impact that your work has had. And that's where this brag journal is really important. And then connecting this to a previous session that Alex and I ran, I think maybe a month ago, we talked about the resume session, right? And that's like a super popular one that we've talked about resume, and we have a lot of opinions about resumes. The number one piece of feedback with resumes that we give is you have to connect your work, your past experience, to business impact. And this is exactly the same advice that we're giving here, which is that whatever you've done in that previous half, you have to be able to connect it to impact, business impact. And that could either be a metric changing, or it could be an internal tool that people are now using. You can track the growth of it over time. Or if you really don't have anything, it could simply be like your peers telling you, hey, the thing that you worked on is really high quality. Well, ideally you would have something, a bit more concrete than that, but you need to be able to connect it down to some numbers, quantify your impact, so it's easier to defend for your manager. Anything, Alex, to add here?
Yeah, I think that all is good. Yeah, the brag journal it serves a lot of different purposes. Like the performance review aspect is, of course, is very important, because like generally what happens is you'll write a reflection for yourself. Actually have like, you know, Alex has done XYZ and this is why I believe they deserve a promotion. But honestly, it could just be a good self-esteem booster. Like if you're feeling down and you feel like you're not doing well, you're not getting anything done, and you're not really moving as fast as you should, you can just kind of open it up and see the awesome things that you've done in the past and remind yourself that yes, you are a good engineer, you're just having a bad time.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Sometimes you need that confidence boost, and that brag journal is super helpful for that. And one point I wanted to make here is that an important part of growth, obviously, is being able to get feedback. And you might not have feedback. Like you're obviously not going to be objective about your own growth or your own feedback. And that's where you need to actually ask for feedback from your manager, certainly, but also the other people around you who have worked with you. And the key thing I can advise people here, that you have to give permission to other people to give you feedback. Like inherently, it is very difficult to hear something negative about yourself. And as a result, most empathetic people in the workplace will avoid giving you negative feedback, right? Just because they know that, okay, it's hard to hear. And the tension is that even though it's hard to hear, that will be critical for you actually being able to unlock more impact and get promoted or grow your career in whatever way you define, right? And so what I've done, which has really worked out for me, is for the key people in my organization who I feel like I've worked with and they can tell me objectively how I'm doing, I will schedule a one-on-one with them. And the cadence of that, the frequency of that will depend based on who the person is, or like, how busy they are versus how much feedback I think they'll give me. It could be like a once a quarter thing, or it could be a once every month thing, depending on, who they are. But I'll schedule a separate one-on-one with them and say, this is a feedback one-on-one. I would love to hear from you if you think there are things that I could be doing better to improve our relationship, or just to have more impact in our team. And almost everyone is going to accept that invite, right? It'd be kind of a bad move, like for them to say, no, I don't have time for this, right? Like a big part, especially at these big tech companies or any tech company, is about being helpful, right? So like it's kind of, they should really be taking that meeting. And when you make that agenda explicit, that, hey, in this half an hour, I don't want to talk about project updates. I don't want to talk about, like the new feature being launched. I don't care about that for this meeting. What I care about in this meeting is I want to hear feedback from you about what I could be doing better. And so when you give permission to people to tell you that, you're much more likely to hear it. And I think that has been really helpful for me to understand, like, how are people perceiving my work?
Yeah, like adding on to the point of that Rahul had before about you're not going to get feedback unless you're essentially proactive about it and give permission. Like if you're working in a place that has a reasonable behavioral round, all the people you're working with are going to be kind and nice, because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to get into the company. And if you're a kind and nice person, you're going to want to avoid giving like the really hard hitting constructive feedback by default, because you don't want to hurt, your coworker, you don't want to hurt your colleagues, right? So that's going to be their default mode of operation. So unless you tell people like, hey, I appreciate, I want to be kind and nice and generous, and I want everyone else to be that, but I also appreciate honesty. So if you think I'm struggling with something, just like let me know. I think that's super helpful. And I do this as well, not to the extent of Rahul, but essentially what I do when I join a new team, like I somewhat recently did joining Robinhood, is I'll schedule one-on-one with folks I'm probably going to work with a lot. And then one of the things on the agenda for these intro one-on-ones is discuss working styles. And when I discuss my working style, one of the first things I say, and I place a lot of emphasis on it, is like, I really value like honesty and transparency. So if you have feedback for me, especially constructive feedback, just let me know. Like if something I'm doing is like bothering you, or it's, it's suboptimal and this doesn't work with it doesn't vibe with what you're doing, just like let me know as soon as possible. And I think that's just really important, because this is something we talked about in our previous session as well. Feedback is truly a gift. It is one of the most valuable gifts that you can get in your career. And it's not only it's a gift because feedback is one of the most important pieces of fuel to get you promoted. And I know like a lot of folks who got promoted really fast, and honestly, they were just really good at getting feedback. They were really good at building a relationship with people where they feel comfortable giving them feedback, and they were very good at acting on that feedback almost immediately. So the rate of improvement was just astronomical.
Yeah, and one more point I want to make here is I just wanted to share this article. Let me actually put it in the Zoom chat. This is written by a VP at Facebook. And when I read this Medium article, it honestly changed my whole perception to how to approach one-on-ones. So you don't have to read it right now. I'll just give you the core thesis of it, which is that your one-on-ones should be awkward. What that means is that oftentimes, you go into your one-on-one, and because of what Alex mentioned, you have a tendency to wanting to be nice or wanting to celebrate wins. You go into a one-on-one and say, hey, you did a great job here. Or like, you're a rock star. Like people have all these platitudes. They're like, you're killing it. You're doing amazing work. And then you leave the one-on-one feeling good, but then you get disappointed at the end of the performance cycle when you don't get the promotion or you don't, advance your career as fast as you'd like. And so this article basically talks about how your one-on-ones should be awkward, meaning that you should be talking about things which you cannot talk about outside your one-on-one. So for example, going back to what I just said, for me to tell you that, hey, you've done an amazing job on this project, I could, and in fact, I probably should be acknowledging that great work that you've done in a team meeting, because that is so easily made public. Like there's no one who's going to feel bad about me saying, hey, you've done a great job on this project. I love how much work you're putting into it. It's delivered on time with high quality, right? And so if you ascribe to that notion of like the things that can be said in front of other people should be said in front of other people, that means the valuable one-on-one time that me and you have, I'm going to tell you something which only you and I would only be comfortable for me and you to hear. And if there was a third person in the room, it would be very uncomfortable for them. So I'll tell you like, hey, you really should improve your code quality in this example and this example. Like that's the kind of thing that I wouldn't call out in a team meeting, but I should be calling out in a one-on-one. And so this framing really changed my perception of like, how should I be entering into these 30-minute, 1-hour conversations with key people? If I'm not having something difficult or awkward to say, you're probably not doing it correctly. That's the really kind of extreme way of looking at it, perhaps, but it's helped me quite a bit.
All right. Yeah. Staying in sync with your manager. Yeah, your manager is probably the single most important person in the realm of your promotion. So it's really important that you have a good relationship with them. So yeah, as mentioned before, a lot of like more junior folks just assume that there's this magical all-knowing system that like automatically knows what everyone is doing and then assigns essentially rewards fairly at the end of the half. That is not true. And your manager is going to almost certainly not going to know exactly what you're doing unless you put in a good amount of effort to stay in sync with them in terms of like your wins and what you're doing. And this is like particularly the case in the companies that people want to work for, like either these really big tech companies or these like really fast growing startups. Like these companies are the strongest companies because they move so fast. So it's really easy to get lost in that chaos. And the manager, something important to remember is that your manager is probably also trying to grow as well. They're also trying to get promoted as well. And generally how managers expand their scope is they just manage more people, or they like manage other managers, which essentially indirectly has them managing more people. So with both of these factors in mind, like your manager having a bunch of reports and the company that you work for moving really fast, it's really easy for your manager to lose track of what you're doing. So like what I do in pretty much every one-on-one that I have a weekly one-on-one with my manager at Robinhood. I essentially just like have a list of my wins, just to let them know like what I'm doing. And this is going to be really helpful when performance reviews season comes around, because I can just go through the one-on-one notes, have my manager, and there's like I can see like all my wins because I can just go through the meeting notes and then just pluck out the ones I think are good. And as mentioned before, your performance review result should not be a surprise. You should not be going into the performance review at the end of the year or the end of the half going like, oh man, I did great work, this cycle, but I don't know. You never know. Just cross your fingers and hope for the best. That should not be how you're thinking about performance review. You should have a pretty good idea of what rating you're going to get, maybe plus or minus like 0.5 or 1 rating band, because you should regularly be in sync with your manager about how you're trending. So like don't be afraid to ask like, okay, manager, I'm trying to target this performance review rating by the end of the half. How am I doing? Am I on a good pace where if I continue improving at this rate, I'll get it? Or am I like falling behind? And your manager shouldn't be afraid to tell you that. As as Rahul mentioned before, one-on-ones should be awkward. It's their job to give you this information, because the more transparent you are in these important relationships, the higher the chances of this relationship succeeding, and the easier it is for you to grow. I think one of the easiest ways for people to not perform is just lack of transparency and lack of information. So you definitely want to avoid that. And as mentioned before, it's just feedback is a gift. Your manager is probably the most important person to get feedback from. So yeah, you should ask for feedback regularly. Maybe not every one-on-one meeting, if you're having it weekly, that could be overkill, but I would say at least once a month, just ask like, hey, what am I doing well? What can I be doing better? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the I think there is an art to asking like that. I guess the fourth bullet point, like how you're trending, there is an art to that, because like Alex mentioned, I think if you go into every week one-on-one and say, hey, do you think I'm going to get promoted or not? That can paint the wrong picture, because it kind of is implying that you care more about promotion than the actual work that you're doing. So a better way of phrasing it is what Alex said just at the end, which is that, how am I doing? Is there anything that I could be doing better? Because that way you're focused on improving as an engineer. And as a byproduct of that, you're going to get promoted or you're going to have career growth. And so I think that there is kind of a art form or like a finesse to how you get feedback. You don't want to be overly focused simply on, what rating will I get, or will I get promoted? Yes or no? Because those are very binary answers, but you're probably gonna learn a lot more or grow a lot more from something a bit more nuanced.
Yeah. So once you handle like your self feedback and your manager's feedback, that leaves kind of the rest of the team, like your bench, when it comes to managing feedback. So I think what like a lot of folks don't realize is that you actually have to do some engineering and some like forward thinking about what kind of feedback that you want. And this kind of goes back to a concept that Rahul and I have talked a lot about before, which is working backwards, like working backwards from the end goal. And this is this is, I think, a necessary behavior in order to really grow to senior levels, is you need to be able to take some really big really big goal, and then work backwards from it, breaking it down into the smaller things that you have to do in order to hit that goal. And the big goal we're talking about in this session is getting promoted. So generally what happens when you're getting promoted, going back to the previous point about creating a plan with your manager, is you'll have a plan on how you're going to grow and like what big things you need to do in order to have a good case for promotion by the end of the cycle, which is like you need to deliver like this big project and like have these relationships, etc. You need to make a case for that. You have to work backwards from, okay, by the end of the half, I want to have a reputation as a strong person at XYZ. you need to work backwards from that to figure out what feedback do I need to have in order to prove I've hit this XYZ condition that I've set for my growth plan for the half or for the year. And like an example is like a lot of engineers will grow by essentially expanding their scope outside of engineering. So they have a bigger influence on the product direction. They have a much bigger voice on how the product should evolve, like what features should we add, how should we prioritize them, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're like that sort of senior engineer, for example, you obviously will need feedback from non-engineers. You'll probably need feedback from at least one product manager, one designer. Ideally, they're pretty senior, vouching for, okay, this person has really seriously good opinions on how to evolve the product, and I feel like they're adding value to what I do. So that's something that you should figure out when you're crafting the plan, is what essentially does my feedback bench look like outside of myself and my manager, so that I can prove that at the end of the performance review cycle that I have grown the new skills that I want to grow in order to show that I'm operating at the next level.
Well, and wrapping up the main content that we have, I want to end on a bit more of like a, how do I say this, somber note maybe. So basically, I ran a poll on my YouTube asking people, do you have clarity on what you need to do in order to get promoted at your company? And so, there's 112 votes. That's not a huge number, but I think this is still significant enough that it's worth talking about. And the majority of people said, I don't have clarity about my career growth. And, that could either be attributed to the company not communicating it clearly, or maybe the person themselves hasn't bothered to take the initiative to understand. But that's really what I want to end on, which is that oftentimes, if you feel like you don't have clarity for whatever reason, it may actually be in your interest to switch jobs, right? Like your career is really important to you, right? That's kind of like everyone agrees with that. But your career may not be as important for the company, or almost certainly will not be, right? And so if you feel like the best thing for you is to switch your job and go to a place where you have more growth and more support, then you should 100% do that. And this is the kind of advice that I think Alex and I are equipped to give you. You will not get that advice to switch jobs from the HR team at your company, right? Like that is kind of not in their interest to tell you to look around. But I'm telling you that it certainly could be worthwhile. And let me give you one very concrete, one concrete example, which is that you can actually get promoted via a job switch. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I put some thoughts together in a LinkedIn article. I don't know if you've read that article that I posted on LinkedIn. Can you give me a thumbs up? Basically, one of the points I made in that LinkedIn article was that I know several people who came into a new job at a higher level than their previous role. And just because we're on the call together, I'll tell you right now that that person I'm talking about is me. So I left Pinterest at a certain level, and I actually came in at a higher level at Facebook. And I knew that I interviewed well, and that kind of played into it. But I think it also goes to show you that if you feel like there's not as much velocity in your upward trajectory at a current company, there is a really good chance that you could switch and see a much more immediate lift. And that's because when you interview at other companies, you actually have some amount of leverage because they don't have you and you can easily walk away. Whereas at your current company, you don't have as much wiggle room or as much leverage in a negotiation. And going back to another thing that we talked about, which is that your manager is so critical to your growth. And so if you feel like your manager, for whatever reason, isn't on your side, then that's a problem. And you should at least switch teams or switch companies if you feel like you're not able to repair that relationship. And there's also, like, in the Slack community, it's so interesting to hear about, the different opportunities that people are exploring. One of the people in Slack talked about how they had basically they graduated from some boot camp and they had an offer for a company where they're doing remote work for like $12 an hour. So there's like a pretty low wage for a programming or software engineering job. And I asked the question, okay, what will your role in the company be? Because if you actually have the structure around you to get feedback and grow and see what you can do better and expand your scope, then it could be good, even though the pay is pretty awful. But it turns out that there is no like structure in this company. It's like what I'll refer to as a commodity coder. And those are the kinds of jobs that you want to run away very quickly from. If you're a commodity coder or a code monkey, where you're just given a task and you have no creativity, you have no scope of shaping the direction or no scope of getting feedback, you will not be able to grow your career. And especially if you have a manager who is not incentivized to help grow their team or grow their scope, then no one is on your team. And so those are the kind of companies where I feel strongly that you should not be there and you should actively be looking for a better company. So if you have questions about that, Alex and I are happy to talk about, your situation on Slack, but I definitely wanted to make that clear because I think there are some companies that are taking advantage of, people who are just coming out of college or out of boot camp. And you need to make sure that you're at a company which will invest in your career growth because your career is too important to, let that be passed up or not taken seriously by a company. All right, Alex, anything to add before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think it's an important option to talk about, the nuclear option. I think, to be honest, most companies are not where I want them to be when it comes to supporting their own engineers. So unless you're starting off at one of those top companies like Facebook or Pinterest, you're probably gonna have to do a career switch, and that's really normal. I think the average turnover rate is like every 2 years in this industry, especially for engineers, which is crazy. But yeah, it makes sense.
Cool. So with that, I hope you were able to take away some of these lessons about growing your career and in particular how to get promoted wherever you are. So our next session is about answering your tech questions. So typically what we do now is we're going to open up for a Q&A right now, but Alex and I, we only have a limited amount of time for Q&A today. So we've actually run into this problem in the past few sessions where we don't have enough time to answer everyone. And so we're creating a dedicated session for just answering your questions about, what our background is or what your questions are about advancing your career or whatever it might be. So please do join that. Alex linked it in the Zoom chat. This is going to happen 2 weeks from today, which is August 4th, 7 p.m. California time. And if you want to get notified about future sessions beyond just this next one, please do join us on LinkedIn and Slack and you'll get notified.
Yeah, and then for this Q&A event, there's a lot of reasons why I think people should join. And I think one thing that I want to point out with this event is we're trying out something new. So as mentioned before, this community is, about people helping other people, not just Rahul and I helping all of you guys, but like folks within the community helping other folks in the community. So Rahul and I try to make this community, we want the community to power itself as much as possible. And we're trying out something experimental that we're going to need your help with this Q&A session to really have that community powering the community vibe. So what we're going to do with this session is we're going to crowdsource questions ahead of time. And we're going to compile a giant list of all your questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to put them all into a poll. And we want you guys to vote on these dozens of questions that we've gathered on which ones you want answered the most, and you can vote for as many as you want. And then once the time of the session comes around, then we will answer the top 5 questions from the poll. Like we'll just read off the top 5 questions from the poll and answer them to start off the session, because it's possible. We don't normally, what happens in Q&As is kind of a free for all. Like whoever comes into the session and raises their hand first will get their question answered first, and that's not entirely fair. So like if you're not able to win that race, like we want you to be able to have an influence on the questions that you want getting answered. And assuming the questions are like pretty compliant and not sensitive, we're going to polish and record our responses to those questions as well and put them on YouTube. So even if you can't make the session, you can still have an influence on the direction of the session. You can still essentially help power the questions that we answer, so that we're answering essentially the most important questions to you guys within the community. So yeah, we would love for you guys to take part in that experiment. And yeah, we're looking forward to seeing how this goes. And last note is Rahul and I are pretty busy for most of the first half of August. So this will be our last session for a while. The session after this tech Q&A one is probably going to be like end of August or early September. So yeah, it's just an opportunity for us to see you guys before we kind of do our own thing outside this community.
And by the way, quick meta point here, going back to what I had said at the very beginning, is that this whole community that Alex and I have been running is actually very, very young. Like, it's brand new. We're still learning a lot. And this is a good example of what we're trying out. It's like just a raw Q&A session. There's actually not an agenda behind it that Alex and I are going to present. And if it goes well, we'll do it more. If it doesn't go well, we won't. But it's kind of going back to the same idea of like, hey, we're going to try out TikTok as a way to deliver our message or deliver some value to people. If it doesn't work, it'll go away. Instagram will try it. LinkedIn will try. Like, we're trying all these things. And so again, if you have feedback about what works for you, what you want to see, we're all ears. So please do let us know.
Yeah, and the last thing before we jump into Q&A, because I'm really biased towards this, I was thinking again, is we would love for you guys to join the Slack community. We really enjoy like interacting and talking with you guys, and we can still do that because like the community, we have several thousand people, but it's still pretty young, and it turns out that we can still be pretty hands-on with like 3,000 over 3,000 people in the Slack community. So yeah, we would love to like directly answer your questions in Slack and help you with interviewing, help you with resumes, and help you with promotion, as this session has talked about before. And a big part of getting promoted is you need good mentors. Ideally, you can find these mentors like within your company, either through your manager or your tech lead, ideally both. But if you somehow have neither, you don't have like a good tech lead to learn from or a good manager to learn from, you can essentially have Rahul or me or both of us as these as essentially mentorship figures, and we can do this through Slack while you probably go look for a different team or for a different company. And this is still relatively recent, but I actually spun up a one-on-one chat program within Slack. So if you want to chat with me one-on-one, there's a channel on Slack where you can opt into that program. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've talked with, I think 15, 20 people one-on-one in this community now. It's such a joy, like learning your stories and where you're coming from and like what obstacles and challenges you're facing. It really makes me feel in sync and in tune with the community. And I feel like I'm learning a lot because in the end, like I'm just one person, Rahul's just one person. We took a path to get to tech. There's thousands, if not millions of paths that you can get into tech, and we don't know those paths. So we would love to learn more. So yeah, we would love to get to know you guys in Slack. So please join Slack. Linked it again.
Perfect. All right. So why don't we go top to bottom? Try and keep your question like one question at a time, and then Alex and I one of us will reply to it. So we'll start with Sharia.
Yeah. And then if you have a question, just use the reaction to raise your hand.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yeah, there's a way to raise hand in Zoom. So please use that. But yeah, okay, Sharia, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Rahul and Alex, for hosting this. I quickly wanted to ask, earlier, Alex talked about generating like social currency or social capital, like positive social capital. I wanted to ask about how can a junior engineer avoid creating too much negative capital by asking like too much help, or because as a junior engineer, you get to stuck, you end up getting stuck a lot. So that was my question. Let me know if that makes sense, or I can clarify it.
That's a great question. I'll take this one since it's referring to the concept I talked about earlier. So negative social capital should be pretty hard to generate. So there's like neutral, which is like you don't really have a relationship at all. Positive, which is they like you, and neutral is they hate you. Negative should be hard to generate. I actually want to push back on the example that you brought up. In that I actually think by asking questions, you actually are generating social capital, because when you're asking a question, you're putting yourself out there. Someone has to answer. So someone has to interact with you. And I think what a lot of junior engineers don't realize is that if you're asking a question, you're actually creating a resource for the entire team. Like assuming you're documenting the answer to the question correctly, there's probably another junior engineer on the team who probably has the exact same question that you do. So you're actually helping them. So I would actually push back on the idea of like needing help and asking questions as negative social capital. It's actually quite the opposite. But of course, there is a nuance to it. honestly, Rahul and I could probably give an entire session on how to ask good questions,
Yeah.
and it would probably be pertinent to like how the Slack community functions as well. But I firmly believe that as long as you ask good questions and you're just a polite individual in general, asking questions and looking for help is a strong generator of positive social capital if you do it correctly. And I think the main thing to asking good questions is you just want to make sure that when you ask a question, input in, output out. So if you put a lot of input into your question, like you add a lot of context and you add a lot of links, and you, most importantly, share what you've tried to unblock yourself already as part of your questions, and people will really appreciate it. I think the only way to really generate negative social capital of asking questions is when you don't add context. You just go like, hey, here's an example of that question. Like, oh yeah, my Android Studio is stuck. And that's your question. Like, my Android Studio is stuck. How do I fix it? There is absolutely no information for anyone to unblock you, because there's a billion ways that Android Studio can be stuck, and they're going to have to spend additional time just to essentially tease the full question out of you, like asking, okay, how are you stuck? What error code are you getting, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as you're not asking questions like that, which is, I think, pretty easy to avoid, as long as you put 10 to 15 minutes of effort into your question format before you get it out there, it's almost certainly a good question, and it should build positive social capital. And going back to the broader point of avoiding negative social capital is just, honestly, don't be mean, and just be considerate and empathetic. And then you should avoid generating negative social capital. But yeah, good question.
Yeah, and actually, I'm trying to. I want to plug myself here. I made a whole YouTube video. I love this question. I made a whole YouTube video about asking good questions. Oh, why can't I find it right now? All right, I'll dig it up after we get to Wyatt's question, but hopefully that'll also help. Sorry. All right, Wyatt, go for it.
Hey, Raul and Alex, thank you so much for doing this. My question is actually a little different. Like, it's not how do I get promoted per se. It's more like I want to switch track to either to another company or internally in the same company, because I'm currently a QA engineer, and I would love to do dev work, just be a developer, software engineer in the future. Do you guys have any suggestions or recommendations for that?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. This is super common. Like, I've talked to a bunch of people, either who I've worked with directly or other people who want to do like a lateral switch into another career ladder. So I think there's a couple things depending on the context. One is that if you're in a situation where you can define your work to some extent, one really powerful tactic is start demonstrating the competency and the know-how of the thing that you want to switch into. So you're a QA engineer, and did you mention why? I forgot. Did you want to go into software engineering, or did you want to do something else?
Yeah.
Software. Okay, yeah. So then that's actually works out pretty well, because like QA engineering and like SDE, software development engineer, are quite related, at least from the companies that I've been at. And so you can start to think about, how can I extend my work